Welcome to the Disney Parks Podcast, your Disney infotainment podcast. Keep your hands, arms, feet, and legs inside the podcast at all times and get ready for the Disney Parks Podcast.
Hey, welcome to the show, everybody. We have a fantastic interview for you. We are going to talk to Steven Anderson, who is a veteran animator and director with 30 years of experience. He studied at CalArts and worked with Hyperion Animation on Rover Dangerfield before joining Disney in 1985. At Disney, he contributed to things like Tarzan, The Emperor's New Groove, Brother Bear, and directed Meet the Robinsons, I think, which is a fantastic movie. Winnie the Pooh. He also storyboarded for films like Bolt, Tangled, and Frozen. And Steven has taught development at CalArts for 10 years and is now a supervising director on, guess what? Monsters at Work, which premiered on Disney Plus in 2021, which I also think is a great short. So thank you for joining us, Steven.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah. So the first question we always love to ask is, how did your journey with Disney begin?
Yeah, well, I was always a huge Disney fan. Growing up, I was raised on a very strict diet of Disney, pretty much everything, movies, books, TV, Wonderful World of Disney every Sunday night. And just something about Disney. I loved all animation, just as a general thing, but in particular, Disney animation was just really captivated me. I think it was the characters. I think it was the expressions, the appeal in the designs of Disney characters, and then how amazing the animators were at capturing the just such a range of expressions. Something about that really made me just want to draw. When I would go to the theater and see either a new film or a re-release, I just would come home and want to try to capture those characters. And so that led to a real love of drawing, led to, again, love of animation, and then gradually just a love of film in general, movies, just cinema. But I pursued animation since I love drawing so much. And that took me to CalArts in 1988. So when I was a freshman at CalArts, and then that's where everything began for me.
So were you also, probably living in California, were you also like at Disney Park? Did you go to the parks often as well to supplement your Disney diet?
Well, unfortunately, no, because at the time we lived. I didn't move to California until 1988 when I came out to CalArts. So we were not adjacent to any of the parks. But that said, I do remember very vividly 2 visits to Disney World, 78 and 83, 84-ish or so. So got to see the, early Epcot just like a year or two after it opened. And then many, many, many years later, working for Disney, I was relocated to the Florida studio that they used to have at Disney MGM to work on a movie called Brother Bear. I was the story supervisor for that movie, and that was all done out there in Florida. So my wife and my son and I moved out there. For about a year and a half. We were out there in Orlando, and that was like, okay, then we went park crazy because I had my main gate pass. I mean, we must have been at the parks or some resort at least, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a week. Like that's all we did was just soak it up because we rented a house in Celebration, Florida, which
fantastic.
As everybody knows, is very close to Disney, the Disney parks. So we were just constantly there. And so, but I always loved the parks the parks were kind of like this magic thing that I knew existed and I had memories of going, but like, I would see pictures of the parks in the books and things like that. And I just longed to go. But then of course, also moving to California for CalArts. And then working at Disney, of course, we were at Disneyland also, like at least once a month for
Right.
many, many years.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. So what was it like? Because uh, correct me if I'm wrong. Like Brother Bear, I think was one of the first movies they did in Florida. Correct?
Well, it was actually the very first movie they did from beginning to end, A to
Okay.
Z.
Right.
Up to that point, the Florida studio had basically been like a production facility
Hmm.
for LA.
Yeah.
So they had done sequences from Lion King. They had done all the production from, let's see, Mulan and Lilo and Stitch.
Hmm.
But all of the story development and the creative development was done out here in LA,
Yeah.
and then all sent to Florida.
Right.
Brother Bear was the first movie that all the creative as well as production was done
Yeah.
out there in Orlando. There was a small story team out here in California, which is how I
Mm.
got on board with the film.
Okay.
But then eventually everything got
Right.
completely 100%
Yeah.
located in Orlando.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So,
really wish they kept that part of the studio.
oh, me
You
too.
know, and my feeling is like, back then it was they were taking us behind the scenes of how movies are made, whether they're live action or animated, either way. And then kind of we were getting a sense and we were learning, like, hey, this is how this thing is done. And I feel like now it's shifting from, Hollywood studios to more like I think there's another name change coming where they're going to name it the Hollywood Adventure. And now they're putting you inside the movie because you're living your best Star Wars life. You know,
Right.
you're in the movie now. You're not learning how the movie. We taught you how the movie's done. Now you're going to be in the movie. So I feel there's another name change coming for the studios.
That's
You know.
and that's a great pitch for a name for the park, because you're right, that's exactly what it is. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's kind of that universal idea of ride the movies, that old
Right.
slogan they used to have.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and less of a behind the scenes. You're right,
Yeah.
and I know change is just part of life,
Sure.
and we all have to deal with it. But
Yeah.
I know many of us pine for the old days of the
Sure.
Disney MGM studios and how
Yeah.
neat that was. So many
Yeah.
cool things there.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
um. So, what was the inspiration for this book? I mean, you have a great title, Disney in Between, and I kind
Thank
of
you.
know what in between means in the sense of making an animation. It's
Hmm.
the things in between. But what was your inspiration for this book? Because this really goes into some deep Disney history.
Yeah. Well, Disney in Between was first and foremost uh, came out of just my love for the post Walt
Yeah.
era
Hmm.
of Disney films, because that was my Disney. I was born in 1970, so
Right.
just a few years after Walt passed. So
Yeah.
I I of course I loved all the films from Walt's time period,
Hmm.
all the films that he produced himself.
Yeah.
But I just still loved all the new stuff that was coming out during that time period. So for me, I just wanted to kind of revel in that, in those films, and talk to the people
Hmm.
that worked on these films that I
Yeah.
saw growing up, and just find out what all the stories were about. But in tandem with that, it also is very clear to me that this was a time period that gets kind of leapfrogged over in the history books. You
Hmm.
usually go from Walt's death in '66
Hmm.
to, and then there was this time where there were movies like Bedknobs and Broomsticks and The
Right.
Black Cauldron, and then Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg came in, and everything was great again. And then we had Little Mermaid, and then we had
Right.
Aladdin, and then we had Who Framed Roger Rabbit and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I get that. I get it, because those are the two. Those times were very prosperous and very successful,
Hmm.
and I understand why people would skip over that, as we say, in between time,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it was certainly a period where the studio stumbled without having Walt at the helm, and
Yeah.
had to redefine itself for
Yeah.
first and foremost without Walt, and then also had to redefine itself as the world was changing and as entertainment was changing
Right.
from the '70s into the '80s.
Yeah.
And so it's a lesser covered time period in the history books, and so I felt that there were great stories to tell,
Hmm.
and actually very relevant themes, just about these times of transition that we all have in our lives. We all
Yeah.
go through these moments of indecision and becoming something new, but we're not quite the new thing yet. So we're in these moments of a little uncertainty, a little bit of
Hmm.
those gray areas. It's a very much a part of life, and it's
Yeah.
certainly a part of the Disney history. So I
Yeah.
felt it was very important to tell that story.
Yeah. What do you think one of the biggest challenges? I'm sure there were many, but after Walt passed, what was that challenge that the animation studio, the first thing or many things they had to overcome to really, all right, Walt passed, now we have to move forward. What's our plan?
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, the irony that I find so fascinating is that um, their solution to moving forward was to hold really tightly onto Walt, basically, even though his memory,
Yeah.
and continue to do things exactly the way he did them with the exact same people in place,
Mm,
and basically make the same kind of movies that he always made,
yeah.
which I completely get. I understand. I can't imagine how daunting it was for those people who were colleagues of Walt. Some of them were family of
Yeah.
Walt.
Hmm.
How none of them, they were responsible for this great thing that he had created.
Yeah.
So the pressure was huge. So I understand
Sure.
why they would do that. But the irony is that in doing that, in holding so tight to his legacy, they kind of lost sight of one of his biggest core values, which is progress,
Yeah.
forward thinking,
Right.
uh, actually embracing change. When something new comes about, grab it and find a way to use it.
Yeah.
So in a weird way, the change couldn't really happen until they let go of Walt, and
Yeah.
it really wasn't until the late '70s, early '80s, when they started bringing. They had new talent that they were bringing in. They were able to
Mm,
give them more responsibilities, both in animation and live action.
right.
And the company itself started focusing more on the artists that create the movies. Yes, Walt was definitely there, but hey, we have new people coming in. We have
Hmm.
young people coming in. That's really when the Nine Old Men, I think, became really emphasized. I remember
Right.
very clearly during that time period, when Frank and Ollie's book, Disney Animation, The Illusion of Life, came out
Yeah. I'd
in
love to get my hands on a copy of
81.
those.
Yeah, and their book was all about,
Yeah.
yes, Walt was part of it, but it was really more about, here are the people that made all these movies. Here are
Right.
the animators, the storyboard artists, the visual development artists, the
Yeah.
in-betweeners, all these people. And the company kind of started emphasizing that as well, started emphasizing the people, and less about the man.
Yeah.
And not to be sacrilegious, but just the only really way they could really move forward was to let go of him.
Right.
And so I think that was the challenge, that it didn't happen until you had some younger folks coming in higher positions that could start to make that change.
Yeah. Yeah. And who was Ron Miller running the studio when Walt? Yeah. So Ron was running the studio, right? Yep.
Yeah, Ron, let's see, Ron, I think it wasn't until like the mid 70s, mid
Hmm.
to late-ish 70s, that he actually became CEO of the company.
Right. Okay.
But he had already started kind of advancing up through the ranks. When
Yeah.
Walt passed away,
Right.
he was a producer.
Right.
So then Ron continued
Yeah.
um, that trajectory, and then a younger gentleman named Tom Wilhite
Hmm.
um, came in the late '70s as head of publicity,
Right.
then eventually became the VP of production under Ron, like basically
Okay.
right underneath Ron.
Right.
And together, they were the ones that came up with Touchstone
Yeah.
Pictures. Like
Yeah.
they created Touchstone. It was Tom Wilhite who brought in Splash, the Project Splash,
Yeah.
the mermaid
Fantastic
film that Ron
movie.
Howard had done.
Yeah.
Yeah, and totally like a very Disney movie, but totally different from any of the
Right.
Disney movies that have been made before.
Yep.
And to Ron Miller's credit, he's the one that said, yes, we should make this because we need to, in a sense, grow up.
Yeah.
Um, so Tom was at the time he was in his, I think he was mid to late 20s. So he's a young guy
Oh,
coming in,
cool. Yeah.
and he was one of the people that was able to loosen that grip on Walt and say, let's emphasize some other
Yeah.
things. Let's start coming up with some new ways of being Disney. Still be Disney, but how can we do it that's relevant to today?
Right, right. For those that don't know, Ron Miller is Diane Disney Miller, husband. So it was really Walt's son-in-law that was
Right.
kind of picking up the slack there. What was the,
Yeah.
after Walt passed, what was the first animation film that the studios put out? Kind of give people a framework in their head of like timeline where things,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, well, Walt passed away in late 1966, December of 1966.
Hmm.
So Jungle Book came out in 1967, but
Right.
Walt was very involved in that film. So
Yeah.
it really wasn't until The Aristocats,
Okay.
which came out in 70, so 4 years after Walt passed away,
Yeah.
that was really the first movie that, although I believe there was a little bit of development made before Walt passed away,
Hmm.
it was to my understanding, it was basically greenlit after Walt passed away,
Yeah.
and then
Okay.
was determined to be the next
Okay.
one. So you had Aristocats, the next one was Robin Hood, then you had Rescuers, Fox and
Right.
the Hound, Black Cauldron, and then Great Mouse Detective in
Yeah.
this span of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. That'll give people timeline in their head so they
Yeah,
can figure it
little
out. Because we
context.
all thinking, oh, those were the movies in this period of time. Um,
Yeah.
what were some of the innovations or changes that after Walt passed and other people came in? What were some of those innovation changes that were introduced to really kind of push the studio in a new era?
Yeah. Well, number one, it sounds a little odd, but actually opening the doors to young talent. I
Mm,
touched on this a little bit ago, but
yeah.
um, I don't think that the studio had done that since like the late 50s. And I know they had brought in some younger talent on Sleeping Beauty. That was Don Bluth's first movie
Oh
at
yeah,
Disney.
that's right.
Floyd Norman had worked on that
Yep.
film. So they did have some younger talent, but then after that, they didn't bring anybody new into the animation studio,
Yeah.
and it got to a point where the movies were still successful. Robin Hood did really well in 1973. Jungle Book had done great in 67,
Right.
but it was very clear that the giants of animation that worked at Disney that were all trained under Walt,
Yeah.
they were getting older. They weren't going to get any younger. They were getting
Yeah.
older. Many of them were retiring.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, some were passing away.
Yeah.
And the realization was, we're going to lose this art of Disney animation if we don't
Mm,
create a new generation,
right.
create a future for it.
Yeah.
So 1970 was when they brought in the first trainee. And then from then on, it was a regular occurrence and still
Yeah.
continues to be to this day.
Yeah.
Um, I do think, there wasn't a lot of
Hmm.
technological
Yeah.
advancements. I think it was
Right.
all more philosophical.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Had to be a new
again,
mindset. It was the
yeah,
innovation.
exactly. We had to change. They had to change
Yeah.
the way they were thinking.
Right.
Um, I think certainly creating Touchstone and figuring out how to make Disney movies accessible to not just the family audience, but
Yeah.
also to adults without kids.
Sure.
Uh, age those movies up, but still do things that are very Disney.
Yeah.
Um, but then if you look at Touchstone, if you look at Eisner and Katzenberg when they first came in kind of late '84, they really took Touchstone and ran with it. I mean, the
Yeah.
amount of movies that came out under Touchstone versus came out under the Walt Disney Pictures banner after
Yeah.
they showed up,
Yeah.
it's completely
Yeah.
Touchstone dwarfs the amount of Disney movies that
Well,
came
that
out.
was Eisner's
So they
sweet
knew how
spot
to use
because
it.
he came. Yeah, it was his sweet spot. He came from Paramount. That's what he knew best. So
Yeah,
he could,
yeah,
certainly feed that beast, and pump out content on the Touchstone side. But it was the animation side. He was probably like, "Oh, this is a new world for me." You know.
exactly. Yeah,
You know. Um,
exactly. And they knew how to use it.
Yeah. So what was the error like? I think Roy E. Took the helm for a little while too. I remember Save Roy. I remember the whole Save Roy campaign.
Yeah.
Back, I think I had a wallpaper on my computer. It was like, Save Roy Disney. They're trying to throw him out of the company, throw him off the board and all that. But he had, what was the technology? What was it? Cats?
Caps.
Caps. It was caps,
Hmm.
right? What was that about? What was he trying to, if I remember correctly, it was something about trying to make them faster, right? Make the animation movies faster.
Yeah, well, it was a way to bring in it was a way to bring in computers into the animation
Okay.
process to not displace the hand-drawn,
Okay.
technique,
Right.
but a way to aid the artists. So
Mm.
basically, uh, the I think up till towards the end of Caps,
Yeah.
it was all done on, everything was still done on paper, but then all the drawings, all the
Right.
background paintings, everything would be scanned into the computer
Yeah.
and then digitally painted. Like instead of doing
Okay.
cells, like those
Yeah.
clear plastic sheets that,
Yeah.
that they used to do,
Right.
then you would actually paint them digitally.
Yeah.
So it was a way to, I'm trying to remember, I think it's even like computer assisted
Considered production something?
production, something like
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
again, I think assisted is even in the name. So it was
Yeah.
more to be a tool to expedite
Yeah.
um, the traditional hand-drawn
Yeah.
animation instead of the very labor-intensive
Right.
painting the cells and
Yeah.
putting them on a
Yeah.
camera stand and click
Yeah.
click.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, really groundbreaking. Really didn't come until later. Came more
Mm.
cap. See, the first movie was Rescuers Down Under that used caps,
Right.
and that was 91, 2,
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. Close.
Um,
Close enough.
so yeah. So but
Yeah.
yeah, it completely.
Yeah.
But well, I will. Sorry, a quick note on that though. I
Yeah.
will backtrack a little bit what I said in terms of not as many technological advances because computer animation did really come into play in this Disney in between time period that my
Mm.
book takes place in,
Yeah.
because you did have Tron, which was 1982.
Sure.
You did have John Lasseter and Glenn Keane had done
Mm-hmm.
a test based on the Where the Wild Things Are book by
Yeah.
Maurice Sendak that
Mm-hmm.
was a hand drawn animation,
Yeah.
computer animation hybrid test. They were trying to figure out how to merge those two
Right.
together.
Right.
Movies like Black Cauldron used a little bit of computer animation.
Mm-hmm.
Great Mouse Detective, the whole climax at the end and the
Yeah.
inside Big Ben was
Mm-hmm.
they used computer animation. So
Right.
that the groundwork for something like Caps and certainly for something like Pixar, just the whole studio,
Right.
like fully computer animated films, those seeds were really sown in the 80s, basically the early 80s.
Yeah.
And because Ron Miller let them explore that.
Yeah. Yeah. That was cool.
Yeah.
Um, the talk about the Eisner, Wells, Katzenberg. I've read Neil Gabler's book. I've read Disney Wars, and when you
Hmm.
read those books, you're like, "Ooh, the." Seems like there was a lot of tension between these three people,
Yeah.
but that's where I think the movies that probably most people will remember. Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid. That it came from that those four guys. So
Yeah.
talk about that era there a little bit, and what they did to change things up and make it how we got these fantastic movies from that era.
Yeah. Well, I think it was really about, you know, I know Jeffrey Katzenberg initially
Mhm.
had no clue, as you said a few minutes ago, had no clue what to do with animation.
Yeah. Right.
In fact, there were moments where it seemed like he was just going to shut it down
Yeah.
because it really, they had just come off of the Black Cauldron, which didn't make any money.
Right.
The movies prior to that were doing okay, but not great.
Yeah.
And their charge, Eisner and Katzenberg's charge, was really more about live action, reinvigorate the live action side of things.
Yeah.
So, they almost killed it. But it wasn't until I was told that there was Jeffrey went on a vacation and he brought Frank and Ollie's book, The Illusion of Life, with him and actually apparently read it from beginning to end and came back and was everybody looked at him and said, "Wow, you're different. You've changed. You're a little more rejuvenated about this animation thing." And then
Yeah.
Jeffrey really leaned into it and started
Yeah.
owning it and realizing that it had a really strong potential to make, to tell great stories.
Yeah.
I think up until then, the ambition for Disney animation was fun, cute, charming, which I love. I have nothing against that.
Sure. Nope.
But the ambitions weren't, let's make something huge. Let's make something enormous. Let's make something that can really hit a large audience. And certainly that empowered then the filmmakers, the animators, and the directors and the story people, because that was always what their ambitions were.
Right.
So many of them talked about, to me, when I was doing interviewing for this book, they talked about seeing Star Wars. They talked about seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark. They talked about, the Lucas Spielberg era of the blockbuster.
Right.
And they kept looking at those saying, why can't we make those movies in animation? Why? Like they're in a lot of ways they are animation. They're because they're such heightened reality, and they're also the genres that Disney worked in. They're fantasies, they're adventures. Like that's what Disney used to do. And they would always say, why can't we do that in animation? There was but the leadership at the time did not have any ambitions beyond just sort of the status quo again.
Yeah.
So Jeffrey, I think, really created that framework and energized everybody to really raise the bar and like make great movies. Don't just make good movies or okay movies. Let's make great movies.
Right.
And that's why we got the Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King. We got that era there, the Renaissance.
And it was really a trifecta, right? It was great animation, great storytelling, and great music.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people give Menken and Ashman the credit, but if you put other soundtrack to that, it probably wouldn't be as great as it was.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that trifecta there it was a great combination that made those things
100%.
Really pop.
And it's funny because we talk about Disney musicals now. Well, it really wasn't until Ashman and Menken came in that there were a Disney musical. I mean, Walt Disney had done Babes in Toyland really early, which was a musical, which I don't think it was very successful. Obviously, he did Mary Poppins.
Right.
Tried again with a movie called The Happiest Millionaire, which was not a success.
Nope.
Then after Walt, they tried with Bedknobs. They tried with Pete's Dragon.
Yep.
None of those really connected with audiences. Nope. So there really wasn't a Disney musical like a formula until Ashman and Menken, until Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. And now, it's sort of a genre all into itself. And then we've got Broadway versions of them, and we got animated versions, and But yeah, to your point, Ashman and Menken really
and that
kicked it
really
off.
tells the story of the music behind the movie is probably just as important as that story.
Yeah, 100%.
So
definitely.
You spoke about the interviews you did. So, of all the people that you interviewed for this, what were some of the insights that you gathered from, probably this, I can't even imagine the list you went through of the people, but it's probably a long list of dubious animators that people are like, wow, that's pretty cool. So what were some of the insights you learned from, this list of people that you interviewed?
Yeah. Well,
and is there a favorite?
Yeah.
And maybe I shouldn't ask that question.
No. Oh, that's okay, because I can wrap them all. I can wrap all those in one answer.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a gentleman named Bernie Mattinson. I don't know if you're familiar with Bernie.
Yeah.
He just passed away early last year.
Yeah. I think people call him Bunny, right?
I don't know. Maybe
Bunny?
Maybe
Bunny?
some in jest.
Yeah.
But so Bernie passed away in February last year, and he was just like, that was 4 or 5 months shy of him celebrating his 70th anniversary at the Walt Disney Company. He is the longest running Disney employee that in
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
He started in 1953
Yeah.
as a messenger boy on the lot,
Right.
and then eventually became in-betweener. Then he was a
Mm-hmm.
cleanup artist.
Yeah.
Then he was an animator. He did
Mm-hmm.
story. He directed Mickey's Christmas Carol and Great Mouse
Mm-hmm.
Detective.
Yep.
And then he was our good luck charm on Winnie the Pooh, our
Okay.
2011
Yep.
film. We had him on the film with us. And you know, Bernie was there from the 50s
Mm.
to the 2020s,
Right.
basically. Bernie saw it all, except for the early days, the 30s and 40s, 20s. He didn't quite
Right.
see that part. But from the 50s on, Bernie saw it all.
Yeah.
And I think what I loved about, one of the things I loved about Bernie's stories is that he was a fanboy of Walt
Mm.
way back when.
Yeah.
He told me a story about how he was walking behind Walt in the halls of the animation building one time, and of course Walt was smoking a cigarette
Sure.
and finished his cigarette and threw it on the ground and kind of stomped it out and kept walking. And Bernie actually, for a moment, thought, I could just reach down and pick that up, and I could have a cigarette butt of Walt Disney's. He's like, I didn't do it, but I almost did. And just
I would
it's
have
funny
done it. I
because
would have put it in a
I know,
Ziploc bag. Okay, this is good.
no kidding, no kidding. It's funny because you know, being a fan is such a part of culture, our
Yeah.
pop culture these days. It's funny to think back in the 50s
Yeah.
there were even fanboys back then.
Yeah. Yeah.
But on that, this is an odd little tidbit. But on the subject of smoking, I didn't put this in the book, but I just found it fascinating.
Mm.
Bernie was also telling me about how prominent tobacco use was back then. He said you
Oh
would
yeah.
walk into the animation building and you could look down the hall and there was like a haze of like smog at the top of the hallway
Right.
because there was so much
Yeah.
pipe smoking, cigar smoking, cigarette smoking. He said there were even some people had spittoons in
Oh
their
wow.
doorways. There was that
Wow.
kind of tobacco use.
Wow.
That's not really that, you know, groundbreaking of a story. I just find
Yeah.
it fascinating because it's so different from today. Um, and I knew people smoked back then, but I didn't realize it was to
Yeah.
that level.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, Bernie's amazing. He saw it all and pretty much did everything you could possibly do
Yeah.
in the world of Disney animation.
Right. Right.
And Great Mouse Detective was really the movie that saved Disney animation there when Katzenberg came in because
Yeah.
Black Cauldron had done so poorly. They didn't like Black Cauldron.
Right.
And Eisner and Katzenberg asked to see a pitch of Great Mouse Detective, which was already being developed.
Mm-hmm.
And Bernie and John Musker and another man named Dave Mitchner were all directing it. I think Ron Clements hadn't come on yet as a
Yeah.
director. And they pitched him their outline board, and Roy Disney was there as well. Roy E. was there, and so they said thank you. And Roy left with Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, and the guys all, you know, sat there thinking, how did it go? Did they like it? We don't know. And then a while later, Roy came back and talked to Bernie and said, it's a good thing they liked your pitch because they were going to kill animation. And because they liked your pitch for Great Mouse Detective, they want to make the movie and they want to keep it going.
Wow. That's
So,
crazy.
yeah.
Well, thank you for,
Yeah.
for that great pitch.
Thank goodness. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
man, I don't think they knew there was that kind of stakes to that pitch, but
Yeah.
boy, thank goodness that they
Well, probably
they
good
knocked
thing
it out
they
of the park.
didn't because might have been nervous and then blown it, and then we'd have nothing.
Exactly.
You
It would
know.
have been the end
Yeah.
with Black. It would have ended with Black Cauldron. And
Yeah.
that would
And that's the end of Disney movies. That's it.
be it.
Is there a particular movie do you think that like really exemplifies Disney animation? If you said, "Oh,
Any
if you
movie?
watch, yeah, you watch this, it's everything that Disney can do in animation."
Ah, so not necessarily contemporary, but just any time
Yeah, yeah,
at any time
anything.
period.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, for me, my brain always goes to Pinocchio. I think Pinocchio
Mm,
is, to me, is the quintessential Disney animated film.
Yeah.
It's got heart, it's got charm, it's got humor,
Hmm.
it's got lightness as well as darkness. It's got some very dark moments in it,
Right.
which I think the best of Disney films aren't afraid to acknowledge. You know,
Yeah.
Walt was really good
Yeah.
about saying, look, you can't have light without dark. You can't
Yeah.
shy away from the dark parts of
Yeah.
some of these
Yeah.
fairy tales and fables and things.
Yeah.
And that's how kids learn about the world. That's why those
Mm.
stories were written, as to teach kids about the
Yeah.
darkness out there. I think the animation is beautiful. The world that they created, that little Italian village that they created,
Yeah.
Geppetto's village, is just so, you just feel like you can climb into the screen. And back to music. I mean, the
Yeah.
music in Pinocchio, I think, is
Right.
some of the most beautiful music that the Disney studios ever
Yeah.
produced.
Yeah.
And so to me, my anytime I think of the quintessential Disney animated film, that's
Yeah.
where I go
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
Pinocchio.
Yeah. Just you know, you talk about the light and the dark. I always think, why do the parents always have to die in the beginning? Why,
Yeah,
why can't the parents like live a little bit long and then die? It's just like, oh, they're dead right from the beginning. That's it. Every movie, every
yeah,
Disney fairy tale starts with some poor dead parent.
it's
Uh,
true. It's true. It certainly is like it's the most. It's the it's the for kids watching the film. It's
yeah.
the most. Uh, it's the greatest expression of the stakes of a story
Hmm.
that your parents can be taken from you.
Yeah.
And I think it just immediately, like, that's
Becomes
what
real for
draws
them,
you in.
maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Like, oh, I better pay attention to this. Something could happen.
yeah. This is not, yeah, this isn't fooling around.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, just going past the '80s a little bit.
yeah,
Um, uh, Toy Story was the computer animated thing that everybody's eyes went, "Ooh, what the
yeah.
hell?" Uh, what do you think Disney is that the direction now? I mean, Pixar is fantastic. They do a great job in the movies, but is there any that leaking over to Disney animation a little bit more? The way they do things now kind of being handed off to Disney Animation a little bit and say, "Hey, we should try some of this."
A little bit. The studio,
Or are
well,
they still
I
trying to keep to the hand drawn over there and do your computer thing over there?
well, unfortunately, Disney Animation hasn't done any hand drawn. Well, actually, the weird thing is that the Winnie the Pooh film that I directed on
Mhm.
is the last. That's the last hand drawn film
Really?
made by Disney to date. I do think some point there will be something new made.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, and Disney Animation has done some shorts,
Yeah.
and they just released a new
Yeah.
Donald Duck short
Yeah.
on Disney Plus, I think
Right.
today,
Yep.
and that was done hand animated. So they do it. They
Okay.
just haven't made a feature length film
Mm.
since 2011, Winnie the Pooh.
Okay. Yeah.
So since then, it's all been computer animation.
Yeah.
Um, but I know the people there and I left the company in 2021, so I haven't
Yeah.
been part of any of those conversations.
Yeah.
But I still know a lot of the people that work there,
Oh, sure.
and they all love hand-drawn animation and
Yeah.
know that animation, regardless of what type of animation you use,
Hmm.
has such a strong impact on
Hmm.
our culture
Yeah.
and is such a potent way of telling stories.
Yeah.
So I know that there's an appetite to really keep pushing
Yeah.
styles. So it would be great if they could do another feature in hand-drawn animation. So
Yeah.
we'll have to see.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. Tell us, what you're doing with Monsters at Work. I'd love
oh well,
to,
I actually, yeah, I
because it's one
actually
of my
only
favorite
worked on.
movies, and I watched the series, the season one, and now there's season two,
Yeah,
and I'm like, oh my god, it's fantastic.
yeah. Well, I only worked on season one.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I left after season one, but I was a supervising director,
Okay.
one of two supervising directors
Okay.
on season one of Monsters at Work. And I had So each of the supervising directors had a episode director underneath them,
Mm-hmm.
and together we each did 5 of the 10
Okay.
episodes in season 1. And then it was a similar framework for season 2.
Yeah.
And yeah, season 2 is great. I think it's already been, well, yeah, they dropped all the episodes on Disney Plus a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And that was a blast to work on that show.
Yeah. I can imagine.
You know, yeah, it was such a great world to play in, you
Yeah.
know. What
Yeah.
better thing to do than come to work every day and draw silly monsters, you know. Like, so
Yeah.
much fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are you doing these days? What's what since you left Disney 2021? What's keeping you busy
Yeah, well,
besides this
I've been
book?
yeah, that's the big one. One of the big ones is this book, Disney in Between.
Yeah.
I made a live action short last year, just
Okay.
independently, just on my own. So
Cool.
started submitting that to festivals just a couple months ago. So
All right.
fingers crossed that
Yeah.
that we get into some of those. And then otherwise I storyboarded for about a year and a half on the recent Garfield movie that just came out, that's in
Okay.
theaters right now, which is
Yep.
super fun. Directed by my friend Mark Dindal, who directed Emperor's New Groove and
Mhm.
Cats Don't Dance.
Mhm.
And I worked with Mark on Emperor's New Groove, so it was great to be working with him again because he's
Yeah.
a great guy.
Right.
And then currently storyboarding on a Disney Junior show about Ariel from The Little Mermaid.
Oh, all right. Cool.
And season 1 of that show starts, I think, in a couple weeks. I'm boarding on season 2. But having a lot of fun. That's a really, really cute show.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Let's wrap up with, where can everybody first find your book? And then if they want to learn more about you, where can, people find you on the internet? If
Great.
you're on any social, if they want to contact you or follow you, whatever.
Great. Yeah. So the book, Disney in Between, is currently available for pre-order.
Mhm.
You can if you want to pre-order a signed copy, you can go to theoldmillpress.com. That's the publisher. And you can click on the little Disney in Between icon and pre-order the book and get a signed copy. Or you can pre-order it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And then I believe it's September 10th,
Mhm.
is the official book release. So then it'll
Okay.
be out in the world on September 10th.
Okay.
So right around the corner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
All right.
as far as social media, I'm at Steve Hat Guy. Steve, all one word, Steve Hat Guy, on Instagram and Twitter. So
Awesome.
look for me there.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. I think we learned a little bit more about animation today that we didn't know.
I hope so.
And some of the players behind the scenes. So that's always
Yeah.
cool.
Great.
And I always say that, these stories about, everybody that works at the company, we have to interview people and we have to keep their stories going. Somebody said, there was a quote I read that you never really die until they stop telling stories about you.
Yeah, that's great.
So we want to keep the stories going. So this is a
Absolutely.
perfect way to do it. So
Great.
thank you for coming on and just hang tight.
Thank you, Tony.
Yep.
The Disney Parks podcast is not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. All Disney parks, attractions, lands, shows, event names, etc. are registered trademarks of the Walt Disney Company.